I loved her the moment I saw her carrying firewood on her head through a forest path, limping after her foot struck a stone, and I knew, even then, that my entire kingdom meant nothing compared to her. My name is Udit. I was a prince. I say was because by the time the story ends, I had become something far more powerful and far more broken than any prince could ever be. My father, Maharaja Vishwa Pratap, ruled the kingdom of Shikarpur with an iron hand and a warm heart. He was a warrior king, respected by all. And I was his only son, raised on the expectation that I would one day sit on that throne with a queen of noble blood beside me. Suitable lineage, suitable title, suitable everything. Every week, another princess was paraded before me. Beautiful women from wealthy kingdoms, dressed in silk and gold, their fathers eager to seal alliances. And every week I sent them away. My father grew frustrated. My mother grew worried. The ministers whispered behind silk curtains. But no one understood what I was searching for. I didn't even understand it myself. Not until the day I walked into that forest. I had slipped away alone, the way I often did when the weight of the palace felt suffocating. The trees were thick, the air cool, and I was lost in my own thoughts when I saw her. She was walking barefoot on the dirt path, a heavy bundle of firewood balanced on her head, her back straight with a kind of quiet dignity that no amount of wealth can teach. Her clothes were plain, her hands were rough, and she was the most remarkable person I had ever seen. Then her foot caught a stone. She fell hard. The firewood scattered. I ran to her before I even realized I was moving. She looked up at me with dark eyes, not embarrassed, not afraid, just quietly composed, and said, "I'm fine. Thank you." She began gathering the wood herself before I could help. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know anything about her. But something shifted inside my chest in that moment, something that had never moved before in all 23 years of my life. Her name was Premlata. She lived in a small mud hut at the edge of the forest with her elderly mother. She earned their living by cutting and selling firewood, waking before dawn, walking miles, carrying loads that would tire grown men. And she did it without complaint, without bitterness, with a kind of grace that made me feel ashamed of every comfort I had ever taken for granted. I went back to see her the next morning, and the morning after that. We talked for hours about the forest, about her mother, about the stars, about things I had never discussed with anyone inside the palace walls. She was sharp-minded, honest to the point of bluntness, and completely unimpressed by my title. When I told her I was the prince, she blinked once and said, "That must be a difficult life." Not flattery, not awe, just genuine, quiet empathy. I fell in love the way a dam breaks, not all at once, but until the pressure becomes impossible to hold. I went to my father. I should have known how that conversation would go. I stood before him in the great hall, the same hall where generals had knelt and enemies had begged, and I told him I had found the woman I wanted to marry. His face lit up with real joy. He asked which kingdom she was from. I told him she sold firewood. The joy drained from his face so completely, it was like watching a candle go out. "No," he said. Just that one word, quietly. Then louder. "No." Then finally, with the full weight of a king behind it, "A prince of this bloodline will not marry a woodcutter's daughter. That is my final word." My mother tried to soften it. The ministers tried to reason with me. Jagu, the court jester, made some foolish joke to lighten the mood, and everyone laughed. Everyone except me. I stood there in that laughing room and felt something close. A door I had left open my entire life, swinging shut. I made my decision that night. I left a letter on my bed. I took nothing from the palace. No gold, no jewels, no soldiers, no title. I walked out in the dark, and I went to Premlata's hut, and I knocked on her door, and when she opened it I said, "I chose you. I left everything. I just need to know if you'll let me stay." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at her mother, who was watching from inside with tired, knowing eyes. The old woman said, "If you want to marry my daughter, I will not stop you. But can you truly live like this? Like us?" "Yes," I said. And I meant it. We married in a small temple by firelight. No guests. No ceremony. No thrones. Just the two of us and her mother and a priest who asked no questions. It was the most peaceful moment of my life. And for a beautifully ordinary while, we were happy. I learned to cut wood. My hands blistered, then calloused. We woke before the sun and walked the forest paths together, and I sold firewood in the village market, and people who had once bowed to me now haggled with me over prices, and I didn't care. I had Premlata. I had a life that was real in a way the palace never was. Then her mother died. It happened quietly, in her sleep, the way peaceful people sometimes go. We buried her beneath the tree she used to sit under in the evenings. Premlata wept silently for 3 days, and then, on the 4th morning, she rose before dawn as always and said, "We should go cut wood." That was her grief. Quiet, dignified, relentless. Like the woman herself. We continued, but the world outside our little hut was changing. One afternoon, a man fell from his horse on the forest path ahead of us. He was well dressed, a king's garments, clearly, and his leg was badly wounded, gashed open, almost certainly by an animal. He was unconscious and burning with fever. Without hesitation, Premlata knelt beside him. "We take him home," she said. I wanted to argue. We didn't know this man. We had nothing. We were barely surviving ourselves. But I knew that look on her face. It was the same look she had worn the morning after her mother died. The look of someone who had decided what the right thing was and would not be moved from it. We carried him to our hut. Premlata disappeared into the forest and came back with herbs I didn't recognize. She ground them by hand, made poultices, changed them every few hours through the night. I held lanterns, boiled water, sat beside a stranger, and watched my wife heal him with knowledge passed down from her mother, like a quiet inheritance. 3 days later, he opened his eyes. He told us his name was King Sriaban. He had been hunting alone, chased a deer too deep into the forest, became separated from his soldiers, and was attacked by a tiger. He had killed it with his sword, but not before the beast had torn open his leg. He had been riding back toward help when he lost consciousness. He looked around our tiny hut, the packed mud walls, the single lantern, the wooden bowls. He looked at Premlata crushing herbs in the corner, and he looked at me. "Who are you?" he asked. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, the whole story, from the palace to the forest path to the temple marriage to the firewood. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. "I have no children. My queen died years ago. My kingdom has no heir, and my own health fails a little more each season. I have been searching for someone worthy, not by birth, but by character, to take the throne when I am gone." He paused. "I found what I was looking for in a woodcutter's hut." He asked us to come with him. Premlata and I looked at each other. 1,000 unspoken words passed between us in that glance. Then she turned to King Suryaban and said, "We will come." And so, in the strange, winding way that fate moves, I became a king again, not because of my blood, not because of my father's name, but because a wounded man had fallen on a forest path and my wife had refused to walk past him. King Suryaban coronated us in his court with full ceremony. Premlata, my Premlata, the woman who had carried firewood on her head, stood beside me in royal garments with the same calm dignity she had always worn. Nothing about her changed. That was the thing about her. She was the same person in a palace that she had been in a hut, and it made everyone in that court love her without understanding exactly why. King Suryaban's health declined quickly after that. Within months, he was gone. He died peacefully, which was the only kind of death that man deserved. And then the news reached us. A minister arrived from Shikarpur, my father's kingdom, my old kingdom. He walked into my court and stopped dead when he saw my face. "Rajkumar Udit," he whispered, "you're here." He had come carrying a message from a man named Raja Veerbhadra, a neighboring king drunk on ambition, demanding that this kingdom, my kingdom now, surrender or face war. But that wasn't the part that stopped my heart. The part that stopped my heart was what the minister told me next, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. While my father had grieved my absence, while he and my mother had spent their days thinking of me, missing me, blaming themselves, his army had weakened. The generals had grown complacent. The treasury had thinned. And Veerbhadra, watching like a hawk circles a wounded animal, had attacked. My father had lost. My mother and father, the king and queen of Shikarpur, were in chains. In a dungeon. My parents, the people who had raised me, who had refused my marriage out of stubborn pride, but who had loved me in the only way they knew how, they were prisoners of a tyrant who now sat on my father's throne, taxing the people into poverty and calling it rule. I sat very still after the minister finished speaking. Premlata put her hand on mine. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I looked at the minister and said, very quietly, "Go back. Tell Veerbhadra I accept his challenge. Tell him I will meet him on the battlefield. And tell my father, tell him his son is coming." What Veerbhadra did not know, what nobody knew, was what I had spent the past year doing in this kingdom. I had rebuilt its army, not with cruelty, but with loyalty, soldiers who fought for me because I had treated them like men, not weapons. I had studied every neighboring territory. I had built alliances quietly, without fanfare. I had learned in my years of living as a common man exactly what makes people willing to fight for someone. I had become, without intending to, a very dangerous king. The battle, when it came, was brutal and brief. Veerbhadra's army was larger but brittle, soldiers who fought out of fear, not loyalty. Fear breaks. Loyalty doesn't. My forces pushed through his lines methodically, precisely, with a patience that had been trained through years of carrying heavy wood up steep forest paths before sunrise. And then it came down to the two of us, his sword against mine. face to face in the dust and smoke of the battlefield. He was strong. He was skilled. But he was panicking and I was not. I disarmed him. His sword hit the ground. My blade went to his throat. And I looked at him, this man who had imprisoned my parents, who had terrorized my people, who had believed that power meant the right to take whatever you wanted, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not rage, not satisfaction, just a cold, clear certainty. My parents are in your dungeon, I said. I am going to walk you into that court, in chains, and I am going to free them with their own hands. That is what you have earned. He had no answer. I brought him back to Shikarpur. I walked him through the same gates he had conquered, through the same streets he had overtaxed, through the same court where he had sat on a stolen throne. The people watched in silence. Then slowly someone began to clap. Then another. Then the whole street. My minister went to the dungeon. And then I saw them. My father walked into the light, older, thinner, but upright. My mother beside him, her hand in his. They looked at me for a long moment that seemed to stretch across every year we had lost. Then my father's face broke, and he opened his arms, and I walked into them, and I was 23 years old again standing in that laughing hall. Except this time, nobody was laughing. This time, everything was quiet and real and true. I knew, my father said against my shoulder. I knew you would come. You should have known sooner, I told him. And then I held him tighter, so he would understand I wasn't angry. Not anymore. He met Premlata properly that evening, for the first time. He looked at her for a long time, this woman who had refused to be intimidated by his rejection, who had married his son in a forest temple, who had carried firewood and healed strangers and stood beside a king when she was still just a woodcutter's daughter. He looked at her the way men look at things they almost threw away. Then he bowed his head to her. Forgive an old man's foolishness, he said. Premlata smiled, that same quiet, unhurried smile she had worn since the day I met her. There is nothing to forgive, she said. Without your refusal, none of this would have happened. She was right. She was always right. That was one of the many things I loved about her. The two kingdoms were united. Veerbhadra was imprisoned in the very dungeon where he had kept my parents, not out of cruelty, but because that was simply what justice looked like. The people of Shikarpur, who had suffered under his rule, began slowly, carefully, to breathe again. And I sat on a throne that I had never chased, beside a queen that nobody had approved of, ruling a kingdom I had earned not through birth, but through loss and love and years of walking barefoot through a forest before sunrise. People ask me sometimes what the turning point was. When did things change? When did I go from a prince who ran away to a king who came back? I always think of the same moment. Not the battle, not the coronation, not even the moment I disarmed Veerbhadra. I think of Premlata, kneeling in the dirt beside a wounded stranger, her hands already moving to help before she had even made the conscious decision to do so. I think of how she never once asked whether it was worth it, whether the cost was too high, whether she could afford to be kind. She just was. Everything else, the kingdoms, the throne, the victory, was only possible because of who she was. Because I had been lucky enough to be standing on a forest path the afternoon her foot struck a stone. My father built his kingdom on bloodlines and titles. He believed that power was something you were born into, something that flowed through the right veins in the right bodies. I learned something different. I learned that power is built in the years nobody is watching, in the firewood and the forest paths, in the strangers you carry home, in the dignity you keep when the world gives you every reason to let it go. Veerbhadra thought he had taken everything from my father. He had taken the throne, the army, the treasury. But he hadn't taken the one thing that mattered, the son who was already out there somewhere, building something that couldn't be conquered, learning lessons that couldn't be stolen. He came for a kingdom. He never saw me coming.